The moment my sister Rebecca called me her personal bank, I knew our relationship had reached a breaking point. Standing in her future mother-in-law's pristine living room, surrounded by wedding planning materials and expense spreadsheets, I watched as she casually announced to everyone present that I would be covering the remaining $15,000 needed for her dream wedding. What she didn't know was that I had recently discovered her secret credit card debts totaling over $40,000, and her fiancé David had no idea about any of it. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes protecting someone you love means refusing to enable their destructive behavior, even when it means exposing painful truths. The complicated dynamics between Rebecca and me had been building for years, rooted in our very different approaches to money, responsibility, and family obligations that had been shaped by our childhood experiences and our parents' well-intentioned but misguided responses to our individual personalities and needs. As the older sister by 3 years, I had always been the practical one, the child who colored within the lines and followed rules without question. From an early age, I had displayed an almost obsessive need to plan ahead and save for the future, traits that our parents praised as signs of maturity and responsibility. I started working part-time jobs the moment I turned 14, beginning with babysitting for neighbors and progressing to retail work throughout high school and college. My approach to money had been methodical and conservative from the beginning. I kept detailed budgets in spiral notebooks, tracking every dollar I earned and spent with the precision of an accountant. I saved birthday money and holiday gifts in a savings account that earned modest interest, and I researched major purchases for weeks before making decisions. By the time I graduated high school, I had saved enough money to pay for my first year of college without taking out student loans. College had been an extension of this careful financial planning. I attended a state university close to home to minimize costs, lived in the cheapest dorm rooms available, and worked 20 hours a week at the campus computer lab while maintaining a 3.8 GPA in computer science. I applied for every scholarship and grant available, wrote dozens of essays about my career goals and financial need, and graduated with honors while accumulating less than $15,000 in student debt. My entry into the software development field had been perfectly timed with the explosion of interest in artificial intelligence and machine learning applications. The company that hired me straight out of college was developing predictive algorithms for financial markets, and my combination of mathematical skills and programming ability had made me valuable enough to earn rapid promotions and substantial salary increases. By my late 20s, I was earning a 6-figure salary as a senior software engineer, owned a modest 3-bedroom house in a safe suburban neighborhood, and had accumulated substantial savings by living well below my means and investing consistently in retirement accounts and index funds. My financial advisor had told me that I was on track to achieve financial independence by my early 40s if I continued my current savings rate. Rebecca, on the other hand, had always been the charming one, the artistic free spirit who could talk her way out of any situation and who seemed to believe that money was something that simply appeared when you needed it badly enough. She had been the child who could convince our parents to buy her expensive art supplies by promising to create masterpieces, who could talk teachers into extending deadlines with elaborate stories about family emergencies, and who could make friends with anyone within minutes of meeting them. Our parents had unknowingly contributed to these different financial personalities by responding to our individual styles in ways that reinforced our existing tendencies. When I saved money and made responsible choices, they praised my maturity but also seemed to take my good behavior for granted. When Rebecca spent impulsively and got into financial trouble, they expressed concern and disappointment but ultimately always came to her rescue with checkbooks and credit cards. The disparity in treatment had been subtle but consistent throughout our childhood and adolescence. When I wanted a new bicycle at age 12, our parents made me save half the cost from my allowance and chores before they would contribute the other half. When Rebecca wanted the same type of bicycle 2 years later, she simply pestered them until they bought it for her as an early birthday present, despite the fact that she had spent her allowance on candy and comic books. When I needed a graphing calculator for advanced mathematics classes in high school, I researched prices at multiple stores and saved money from my part-time job for 3 months to buy the best model available. When Rebecca decided she wanted to take photography classes that required an expensive digital camera, our parents bought her the equipment immediately and enrolled her in private lessons that cost more than I made in a month of babysitting. The pattern had become more pronounced during our college years, when our different approaches to money and responsibility created increasingly obvious disparities in our lifestyles and opportunities. I had chosen my university and major based on careful research about employment prospects and earning potential, while Rebecca had enrolled in an expensive private art school because she liked the campus and the vibe of the student body. My college experience had been focused on education and career preparation, with limited social activities and minimal spending on anything that wasn't directly related to my academic success. I lived in the cheapest housing available, bought used textbooks whenever possible, and ate most of my meals in the dining hall rather than at restaurants. My entertainment budget consisted of occasional movies and coffee with study groups, and my wardrobe was practical and minimal. Rebecca's college experience had been entirely different, focused on exploration and self-expression rather than practical preparation for adult responsibilities. She changed majors 3 times during her first 2 years, accumulating credits in art history, creative writing, and psychology before settling on a general studies degree that required no specific career focus. She lived in the most expensive dormitories available, bought new textbooks and supplies every semester, and spent freely on clothes, restaurants, and social activities. The financial consequences of these different approaches had become apparent by our junior year of college. I was on track to graduate debt-free with a marketable degree and job prospects, while Rebecca had accumulated over $30,000 in student loans and credit card debt while pursuing a degree that offered limited employment opportunities. Our parents had begun covering Rebecca's expenses during her final 2 years of college, paying for her housing, meal plans, and credit card bills while I continued to work and budget carefully to cover my own costs. They justified this disparity by explaining that Rebecca needed more support because she was struggling academically and financially, while I was clearly capable of managing on my own. The unfairness of this situation had created resentment that I struggled to express or address, partly because I genuinely loved Rebecca and wanted her to succeed, and partly because our parents seemed to view my self-sufficiency as proof that I didn't need or deserve the same level of support they provided to my sister. This dynamic had continued after college, when Rebecca moved back home while pursuing various creative projects and part-time jobs, while I started my career and began building my financial independence. Our parents had continued to cover Rebecca's basic expenses and debt payments, while my success was celebrated but not supported financially. Building a successful career in software development had required long hours, continuous learning, and a willingness to tackle complex problems that other people found intimidating or frustrating. My days typically began at 7 in the morning and often extended past 8 at night, with additional time spent on weekends learning new programming languages and technologies that would make me more valuable to my employer. The work itself was intellectually challenging and personally rewarding, involving the development of machine learning algorithms that could identify patterns in massive datasets and make predictions about market behavior, consumer preferences, and business risks. I specialized in natural language processing and neural network design, areas that required both technical expertise and creative problem-solving skills. My reputation in the industry had grown quickly as I contributed to several high-profile projects that generated significant revenue for my company and recognition from technology publications. I had been invited to speak at conferences, had published papers in academic journals, and had been recruited by larger companies offering substantial salary increases and stock options. By my late 20s, my annual compensation package was approaching $200,000 when including bonuses and equity participation, an income level that allowed me to save aggressively while still enjoying a comfortable lifestyle. I had purchased my house with a substantial down payment that eliminated the need for private mortgage insurance, and I was making extra payments toward the principal that would allow me to own the property outright by my late 30s. My investment portfolio had grown steadily through consistent contributions to retirement accounts and taxable investment funds, diversified across domestic and international stocks, bonds, and real estate investment trusts. My financial advisor regularly praised my disciplined approach to saving and investing, noting that I was significantly ahead of typical savings benchmarks for someone my age and income level. But despite my financial success and growing independence, the complicated relationship with Rebecca had continued to create emotional and practical challenges that affected my ability to enjoy the fruits of my hard work. Her assumption that my resources should be available to solve her problems had become more pronounced as the gap between our financial situations widened. Rebecca, on the other hand, had always been the charming one, the social butterfly who could talk her way out of any situation and who seemed to believe that money was something that simply appeared when you needed it. Our parents had unknowingly contributed to this dynamic by consistently bailing Rebecca out of financial difficulties while praising my responsibility and self-sufficiency. The pattern had started early. When Rebecca was 16 and wanted a car, she convinced our parents to co-sign a loan that she promptly defaulted on when she decided she preferred her boyfriend's vehicle. When she was 18 and maxed out her first credit card buying clothes for college, Mom and Dad paid it off while lecturing her about fiscal responsibility. When she was 21 and accumulated thousands in student debt for a degree she never finished, they refinanced their mortgage to help her consolidate the payments. Meanwhile, I had worked my way through college, graduated with honors in computer science, and landed a job at a growing tech company where my skills in artificial intelligence and machine learning were in high demand. By the time I was 28, I owned my own home, had a substantial emergency fund, and was on track to retire comfortably in my 50s. The difference in our financial situations had created an unspoken expectation that I would step in whenever Rebecca needed help, an assumption that became more pronounced after our parents retired and their ability to support her diminished. Rebecca seemed to view my success not as the result of hard work and careful planning, but as a resource that should naturally be available to help her achieve her own dreams and desires. This dynamic had played out repeatedly over the years. When Rebecca wanted to take an expensive vacation to Europe with her friends, she asked me to co-sign a personal loan. When she decided to move to a trendy downtown apartment that was far beyond her means as a part-time yoga instructor, she expected me to help with the security deposit and first month's rent. When she bought a designer wardrobe for a series of job interviews that never materialized into employment, she assumed I would cover her credit card minimum payments until she got back on her feet. Each time, I had helped her, partly out of genuine love and concern, but mostly because saying no seemed to create family drama that affected everyone. Our parents would express disappointment in my unwillingness to support my sister, and Rebecca would alternate between anger and emotional manipulation until I eventually gave in to her requests. But the situation had escalated dramatically when Rebecca became engaged to David Mitchell, a genuinely nice guy who worked as a high school history teacher and coached the varsity basketball team. David was everything Rebecca usually wasn't attracted to: stable, responsible, kind, and completely unaware of her financial chaos. He lived modestly on his teacher's salary, drove a reliable used car, and had been saving money for their future together with the methodical patience of someone who understood delayed gratification. Rebecca had met David at a community wellness fair where she was promoting her yoga classes, and their relationship had developed quickly into what appeared to be genuine love and compatibility. David seemed to bring out the best in Rebecca, encouraging her to pursue her yoga instructor certification more seriously and supporting her dreams of opening her own studio someday. For a brief period, I had hoped that David's influence would help Rebecca develop better financial habits and a more realistic approach to money management. He had certainly tried to encourage responsible budgeting and had even helped her create a plan for paying off her existing debts, though I suspected he had no idea about the true extent of her financial obligations. The wedding planning process had revealed the fundamental differences in their approaches to money and celebration. David had proposed a modest ceremony at a local venue with close family and friends, followed by a simple reception that would fit within their combined budget of about $8,000. He had researched affordable photographers, suggested a potluck-style reception, and even offered to handle the music himself using a playlist and rental speakers. Rebecca, however, had very different ideas about what her wedding should look like. She wanted the ceremony at an expensive downtown venue, complete with professional photography, videography, a full catering service, designer flowers, and a live band. She had spent months researching destination honeymoon options and had her heart set on 2 weeks in Italy that would cost more than David made in 2 months. The conflict between their visions had created tension in their relationship, with David expressing concern about starting their marriage with significant debt while Rebecca argued that their wedding day was too important to compromise on. She had convinced him that the additional expenses were necessary investments in creating memories that would last a lifetime, and that they could always pay off the debt over time. What David didn't know was that Rebecca had been secretly applying for credit cards in her own name to fund the wedding expenses he thought they were saving for together. She had become expert at exploiting promotional credit card offers, taking advantage of 0% introductory rates and balance transfer deals to juggle debt between accounts while maintaining the illusion of financial stability. Over the past 6 months, she had opened 5 different accounts with major credit card companies, carefully timing the applications to avoid having too many hard inquiries on her credit report at once. She had started with a rewards card that offered cashback on purchases, using it to buy wedding-related items while telling David she was getting discounts from vendors. Then she had applied for a card with a generous sign-up bonus, using the promotional credit to pay for deposits on venues and services. The third card had been a balance transfer offer that allowed her to move existing debt from other accounts while gaining access to additional credit lines. The fourth was a store card from an upscale bridal boutique that offered special financing for wedding purchases, which she had used to buy her dress, shoes, and accessories without revealing the full cost to David. The fifth was a general-purpose card with a high credit limit that she had used for cash advances to pay various wedding vendors who required upfront payments. In total, these new accounts had given her access to credit lines totaling over $25,000, money that she had been spending as freely as if it were her own savings while maintaining detailed spreadsheets that tracked which expenses were being charged to which cards. She had become skilled at manipulating payment due dates and minimum balance requirements to avoid missed payments that would damage her credit score and potentially alert David to her activities. But the credit cards were only part of Rebecca's complex web of wedding financing. She had also been borrowing money from friends and distant relatives, using different stories and justifications with each person to avoid anyone getting a complete picture of her financial situation. She had told her college roommate that she needed $2,000 for flowers because the original florist had gone out of business and she had lost her deposit. She had convinced her aunt to lend her $1,500 for photography because David's grandmother wanted professional pictures but couldn't afford to pay for them herself. Her most audacious loan had come from David's own cousin, whom she had convinced to lend her $3,000 for the honeymoon by explaining that David wanted to surprise her with a trip to Italy but didn't want to put the expenses on their joint savings account where she might see the charges. She had promised to pay everyone back after the wedding when she expected to receive substantial cash gifts from guests, a plan that depended on receiving far more money than was realistic given their modest guest list and the economic circumstances of their families. Rebecca had also been exploiting various wedding-related services and vendor relationships in ways that created additional financial obligations without David's knowledge. She had signed contracts with premium vendors by agreeing to payment plans that extended beyond their wedding date, essentially taking out informal loans secured by future income that she wasn't sure they would have. The wedding photographer she had selected charged $8,000 for his premium package, but Rebecca had negotiated a payment plan that required only a small deposit upfront with the remaining balance due in installments over the following year. The caterer had agreed to similar terms for a menu that cost nearly twice what David thought they were spending on food. Even the band she had booked was expecting payment that totaled more than David made in a month, with most of the money due after their performance. These deferred payment arrangements had allowed Rebecca to secure the expensive wedding she wanted without immediately revealing the true costs to David, but they had also created a mountain of debt that would become due shortly after their honeymoon when vendors expected to receive their final payments. She had been counting on wedding gifts and her expectation that I would help with costs to cover these obligations, but she had no realistic plan for handling the debt if those sources of money didn't materialize. The most troubling aspect of Rebecca's financial deception was how systematic and calculated it had become. She maintained detailed records of her various debts and payment schedules, kept multiple credit cards and loan documents hidden in a locked box in her apartment, and had even created fake email accounts to correspond with creditors without David accidentally seeing the communications. She had also been manipulating their joint budget discussions by providing false information about wedding costs and her own financial contributions. When David asked about specific expenses, Rebecca would show him invoices that reflected partial payments or promotional discounts while hiding the actual full costs and payment terms. She had become skilled at deflecting his questions about money by changing the subject to romantic aspects of their wedding planning or by expressing emotional stress about the complexity of organizing such an important event. The psychological toll of maintaining these deceptions had been obvious to anyone who knew Rebecca well, though David had interpreted her anxiety and mood swings as normal wedding planning stress rather than signs of financial desperation. She had been losing sleep, drinking more alcohol than usual, and displaying uncharacteristic irritability when anyone asked detailed questions about their wedding plans or budget. I had noticed these changes in Rebecca's behavior during our conversations about the wedding, but I had initially attributed them to the normal pressures of planning a major life event while working part-time and trying to build her yoga instruction business. It wasn't until I discovered the extent of her debt that I realized her emotional distress was actually a symptom of the enormous financial pressure she had created for herself and David. I had discovered the extent of Rebecca's deception purely by accident when she had asked me to let her use my computer to print wedding invitations, claiming her laptop was broken. While she was in the bathroom, a credit card company called my house phone looking for her, and when I mentioned it to her, she became defensive and evasive in a way that immediately raised red flags. My curiosity led me to do some research that revealed the shocking truth about Rebecca's financial situation. Through public records and credit monitoring services, I learned that she had accumulated over $40,000 in unsecured debt, had missed several payments that were damaging her credit score, and was paying minimum balances that would take decades to eliminate if she ever managed to stop adding new charges. The knowledge of Rebecca's secret debts had put me in an impossible position. I cared about David and felt he deserved to know what he was getting into before making a lifetime commitment to someone whose relationship with money was so fundamentally dishonest. But I also didn't want to destroy my sister's chance at happiness with someone who genuinely loved her and who might be able to help her develop better financial habits. I had tried several times to encourage Rebecca to be honest with David about her debts, suggesting that starting their marriage with transparency would be better than trying to hide financial problems that would inevitably surface later. But Rebecca had dismissed my concerns, insisting that her debts were manageable and that David would only worry unnecessarily if he knew about them. She had also made it clear that she expected me to help ensure that her wedding proceeded as planned, regardless of any concerns I might have about her financial management. Rebecca seemed to view my knowledge of her situation as leverage rather than a warning, confident that I wouldn't do anything to jeopardize her relationship with David. The breaking point had come during a wedding planning meeting at David's parents' house, where his mother Mrs. Mitchell had volunteered to help coordinate vendors and manage the timeline for the ceremony and reception. Mrs. Mitchell was a retired event planner who had spent 30 years organizing corporate events and luxury weddings for wealthy clients, and she had offered her professional services as a wedding gift to help Rebecca and David create their perfect day. Mrs. Mitchell's involvement had been a godsend for David, who had been feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of wedding planning while working full-time as a high school teacher and basketball coach. She had taken over the logistical aspects of vendor coordination, timeline management, and budget tracking with the efficiency and attention to detail that had made her successful in the events industry. The meeting had been scheduled for a Sunday afternoon in the Mitchell family's spacious dining room, which Mrs. Mitchell had converted into a temporary command center complete with vendor contracts, timeline charts, and detailed budget spreadsheets. She had invited Rebecca, David, and me to review the current status of all wedding preparations and to make final decisions about any remaining details. David's father had prepared coffee and homemade cookies for the meeting, while Mrs. Mitchell had organized all the paperwork into neat folders labeled by category, venue, catering, photography, flowers, music, and transportation. She had also prepared a comprehensive timeline that showed exactly when each element needed to be finalized and when final payments would be due. The atmosphere had been warm and collaborative as Mrs. Mitchell walked us through her progress on various aspects of the wedding planning. She had successfully negotiated better rates with several vendors, had identified potential cost savings on flowers by choosing seasonal varieties, and had created a detailed day of timeline that would ensure everything proceeded smoothly. Rebecca had seemed nervous and distracted throughout the meeting, frequently checking her phone and asking detailed questions about payment schedules and vendor policies that seemed unusual for someone who should have been familiar with these details. She had also been unusually quiet during discussions about specific costs, allowing Mrs. Mitchell and David to carry most of the conversation. The meeting had been going well until Mrs. Mitchell presented her revised comprehensive budget analysis, a detailed spreadsheet that showed the total cost of all wedding elements based on the contracts and quotes she had reviewed. She had spent hours reconciling Rebecca's various vendor agreements with the budget that David thought they had established, and the numbers hadn't added up in ways that she found deeply concerning. Mrs. Mitchell had approached the budget discussion with the diplomatic skill of someone who had handled countless delicate financial conversations with clients over the years. She had explained that while she had been able to achieve some cost savings through her vendor relationships and negotiation skills, the total expenses for the wedding as currently planned would significantly exceed what she understood to be their available budget. The spreadsheet she presented showed that they were still $15,000 short of what would be needed for all the elements Rebecca had insisted on including: the premium venue, professional photography and videography, full catering service, designer flowers, live band, and luxury honeymoon in Italy. Even with the cost savings Mrs. Mitchell had achieved, the total expenses would be nearly $30,000, far more than what David had told his mother they could afford. David's face had gone pale as he looked at the numbers, clearly struggling to figure out how they could possibly afford such an expensive celebration on their combined income. He had been operating under the assumption that their wedding would cost around $8,000, a figure that reflected his conservative approach to finances and his belief that love was more important than lavish displays of wealth. Mrs. Mitchell had gently suggested several areas where they could reduce costs without significantly compromising the quality of their celebration. She had researched alternative venues that would be less expensive but still beautiful, identified photographers whose work was excellent but whose rates were more reasonable, and prepared suggestions for simplified catering options that would still provide a memorable dining experience for their guests. But Rebecca had rejected all of these cost-saving suggestions with increasing agitation, insisting that she had already made commitments to specific vendors and couldn't change her plans without losing deposits and damaging relationships. She had argued that their wedding was a once-in-a-lifetime event that deserved the best they could afford, and that finding ways to pay for it was more important than compromising on their vision. The tension in the room had become palpable as David tried to understand how their wedding planning had gotten so far away from the budget they had originally discussed, while Mrs. Mitchell attempted to find diplomatic ways to address the obvious financial mismatch between Rebecca's expectations and their available resources. That's when Rebecca had made her announcement about my role as her personal bank, speaking with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted that I would solve her problems regardless of the cost or inconvenience to myself. She had looked directly at Mrs. Mitchell and David, smiled brightly, and announced that there was no need to worry about the budget shortfall because I had agreed to cover the remaining expenses as my wedding gift to them. The statement had been delivered with such certainty and enthusiasm that for a moment, everyone in the room had seemed to accept it as fact. Mrs. Mitchell had looked relieved that the financial crisis had been resolved, while David had appeared confused but grateful that his future sister-in-law was so generous and supportive of their marriage. I had been standing near the window looking at Mrs. Mitchell's timeline charts when Rebecca made her announcement, and I had turned around in complete shock to find everyone looking at me expectantly, as if they were waiting for me to confirm the generous gift that Rebecca had described. The silence stretched for several seconds as I struggled to process what had just happened and formulate an appropriate response. The most infuriating aspect of Rebecca's announcement was how matter-of-fact she had made it sound, as if we had discussed this arrangement extensively and I had enthusiastically agreed to pay for whatever wedding expenses they couldn't cover themselves. She had presented it not as a request or even a favor, but as an established fact that everyone should simply accept and build their plans around. David had immediately protested, saying he couldn't accept such an enormous gift and that they should scale back their plans to something more affordable rather than asking family members to cover expenses they couldn't handle themselves. His reaction had been exactly what I would have expected from someone with his character and values, someone who understood the importance of living within your means and not burdening others with your financial obligations. But Rebecca had waved off his concerns with the kind of dismissive confidence that suggested she had never seriously considered the possibility that I might refuse her request. She had insisted that I was happy to help because families should support each other during important life events, and that the money meant nothing to me compared to her happiness on her special day. The casual way she had dismissed David's legitimate concerns about accepting such a large gift had been almost as offensive as her assumption that I would automatically agree to provide it. She had made it clear that she viewed his objections as unnecessary obstacles to getting what she wanted, rather than reasonable expressions of financial responsibility and personal integrity. Mrs. Mitchell had looked increasingly uncomfortable with the entire situation, clearly sensing the tension between Rebecca's expectations and David's discomfort with accepting such a large gift from a family member. Her experience in event planning had probably exposed her to similar family financial dramas, and she seemed to understand that the situation was more complicated than Rebecca was making it appear. I had stood there in that perfectly organized dining room, surrounded by wedding planning materials and budget spreadsheets, feeling a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and disbelief that Rebecca had put me in such an impossible position. She hadn't just asked me for money, she had announced to David's family that I had already agreed to pay for their wedding, creating a public expectation that made refusing seem selfish and unsupportive. The manipulation inherent in Rebecca's announcement had been breathtaking in its audacity and cruelty. She had trapped me in a situation where saying no would make me appear petty and ungenerous in front of people whose opinion mattered to me, while saying yes would reward her financial irresponsibility and enable behavior that was ultimately destructive to her relationship with David. But perhaps most importantly, Rebecca's casual reference to me as her personal bank had crystallized something that I had been struggling to articulate for years. She didn't see me as a sister who had worked hard to achieve financial stability. She saw me as a resource to be exploited whenever her own poor decisions created problems that required expensive solutions. The phrase personal bank had been delivered with a kind of affectionate teasing that was supposed to make her exploitation seem playful and harmless, but it had actually revealed the fundamental way she viewed our relationship. I wasn't a person with my own goals, dreams, and financial obligations. I was simply a source of money that should be available whenever she needed it. David had continued to express discomfort with accepting such a large gift, explaining to his mother that he and Rebecca had originally planned a much more modest celebration, and that he didn't feel right about allowing family members to fund expenses they couldn't afford themselves. His integrity and concern for our family's financial well-being had been obvious and admirable, making Rebecca's dismissal of his concerns even more frustrating to witness. But Rebecca had pressed forward with the planning as if the financial question had been definitively settled, discussing menu options and flower arrangements as if $15,000 was a trivial amount that shouldn't require any further consideration or discussion. She had even begun making additional suggestions for upgrades and enhancements that would have increased the costs even further, apparently convinced that my willingness to help meant that budget constraints were no longer relevant. The meeting had been going well until Mrs. Mitchell presented a revised budget that showed they were still $15,000 short of what would be needed for all the elements Rebecca had insisted on including. David's face had gone pale as he looked at the numbers, clearly struggling to figure out how they could possibly afford such an expensive celebration. That's when Rebecca had made her announcement about my role as her personal bank, speaking with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted that I would solve her problems. She told the room that I had agreed to cover the remaining expenses as my wedding gift to them, a complete fabrication that left me speechless with anger and embarrassment. David had immediately protested, saying he couldn't accept such an enormous gift and that they should scale back their plans to something more affordable. But Rebecca had waved off his concerns, insisting that I was happy to help and that the money meant nothing to me compared to her happiness on her special day. Mrs. Mitchell had looked uncomfortable with the entire situation, clearly sensing the tension between Rebecca's expectations and David's discomfort with accepting such a large gift. But Rebecca had pressed forward with the planning as if the financial question had been settled, discussing menu options and flower arrangements as if $15,000 was a trivial amount. I had excused myself from the meeting, claiming I needed to make some phone calls about work, but actually needing time to process what had just happened and decide how to respond. Rebecca had not only lied about my agreement to pay for her wedding, but she had done so in front of David's family, creating a situation where refusing would make me appear selfish and unsupportive. The drive home from that meeting had been one of the longest of my life as I grappled with the realization that my relationship with Rebecca had become fundamentally unhealthy and unsustainable. She wasn't just asking for help anymore, she was taking it for granted and making financial commitments on my behalf without any consultation or consideration for my own goals and boundaries. But more importantly, I realized that continuing to enable Rebecca's financial irresponsibility wasn't helping her. It was making her problems worse while potentially destroying David's financial future and their chances for a healthy marriage. Someone who truly loved her would help her confront her issues rather than allowing her to dig herself deeper into a hole of debt and deception. That night, I had made the difficult decision to tell David the truth about Rebecca's financial situation. Not out of spite or revenge, but out of genuine concern for both of them and a belief that he deserved to make an informed decision about his future. I had spent hours organizing the documentation I had gathered about Rebecca's debts, preparing a clear and factual presentation that would help David understand the scope of the problem without seeming vindictive or judgmental. The conversation with David had been one of the most difficult I had ever had, but also one of the most necessary. I had called him and asked if we could meet privately to discuss something important about the wedding planning. We had met at a quiet coffee shop near his school, and I had carefully explained what I had discovered about Rebecca's secret debts and her pattern of financial deception. David's initial reaction had been disbelief and denial. He insisted that Rebecca had been open with him about her financial situation and that while she had some credit card debt, it was nothing they couldn't handle together. But as I showed him the documentation I had gathered, credit reports, account statements, and records of missed payments, his expression had changed from skepticism to shock to a kind of devastated understanding. The hardest part had been watching David realize that the woman he loved had been lying to him about something so fundamental to their future together. He had trusted Rebecca completely, and discovering that she had been secretly accumulating tens of thousands of dollars in debt while planning an expensive wedding was a betrayal that cut deeper than just the financial implications. David had asked me why I was telling him this information, and I had been honest about my motivations. I explained that I cared about both of them too much to watch Rebecca destroy their relationship with financial deception, and that I believed she needed professional help to address her spending addiction rather than continued enabling from family and friends. I had also made it clear that I would not be paying for their wedding or any other expenses related to Rebecca's financial irresponsibility. While I loved my sister and wanted her to be happy, I could no longer participate in a system that rewarded her for making destructive choices while expecting others to bear the consequences. David had sat in stunned silence for a long time after I finished explaining the situation, occasionally asking questions about specific debts or timeline details that helped him piece together the full scope of Rebecca's deception. He had realized that several mysterious expenses and behavioral changes over the past few months suddenly made sense in the context of her secret borrowing and spending. The confrontation between David and Rebecca had happened the next evening at her apartment, and while I wasn't present for it, I heard about it afterward from both of them. David had presented Rebecca with copies of the debt information I had shared with him, asking her to explain how she had accumulated so much money without telling him and why she had been planning their wedding around expenses they couldn't afford. Rebecca's initial reaction had been to blame me for betraying her trust and interfering in her relationship, but David had refused to be distracted by accusations against me. He had insisted on focusing on the financial deception and what it meant for their future together, particularly given that they would be legally responsible for each other's debts after marriage. The conversation had revealed even more disturbing details about Rebecca's financial situation. In addition to the credit card debts I had discovered, she had also borrowed money from several of David's relatives under the pretense of covering wedding expenses, promising to repay them with money she expected to receive as wedding gifts. She had also taken out a personal loan using false information about her income and employment status. David had been devastated to learn that Rebecca had been lying not just to him, but to his family members who had trusted her enough to lend her money for their wedding celebration. The betrayal extended beyond their personal relationship to include people he cared about who had been drawn into Rebecca's web of financial deception. The wedding had been postponed indefinitely while David and Rebecca attempted to work through the trust issues that had been revealed by her financial dishonesty. David had insisted that Rebecca seek professional help for what appeared to be a serious spending addiction, and that she develop a realistic plan for addressing her existing debts before they could move forward with marriage. Rebecca had initially resisted these requirements, arguing that her financial problems were not as serious as David was making them seem and that she could handle them on her own without outside help. She had also continued to blame me for creating problems in her relationship by sharing information that she felt was private and not relevant to her ability to be a good wife. But as the reality of her situation became clearer, Rebecca had gradually begun to acknowledge that her relationship with money was unhealthy and unsustainable. The prospect of losing David had forced her to confront patterns of behavior that she had been avoiding and rationalizing for years. The process of addressing Rebecca's financial problems had been long and difficult, involving credit counseling, therapy sessions focused on spending addiction, and the painful work of contacting creditors to establish realistic payment plans. Rebecca had also been forced to take on additional work to supplement her income from yoga instruction, accepting a part-time retail job that provided steady wages and health insurance benefits. David had supported Rebecca through this process, but he had also maintained firm boundaries about financial transparency and accountability. He had insisted on being included in all conversations with creditors and counselors, and he had required Rebecca to close all but one credit card account and turn over her remaining cards to him for safekeeping. The wedding had eventually taken place almost 2 years later, but it had been the modest celebration that David had originally envisioned rather than the expensive event Rebecca had initially demanded. The ceremony was held at David's parents' church, with a reception in the fellowship hall featuring food prepared by family and friends. Rebecca had seemed genuinely happy with the celebration, perhaps because she had learned to find joy in meaningful moments rather than expensive displays. My relationship with Rebecca had been strained for months after I revealed her financial secrets to David, but it had gradually healed as she came to understand that my actions had been motivated by love rather than malice. She had eventually thanked me for forcing her to confront problems that were destroying her life and her relationships, though it had taken considerable time and therapy for her to reach that level of self-awareness. The experience had taught me important lessons about the difference between helping someone and enabling their destructive behavior. For years, I had thought I was being a supportive sister by providing financial assistance whenever Rebecca asked for it, but I had actually been making her problems worse by removing the natural consequences of her poor decisions while reinforcing her belief that someone else would always solve her financial problems. The pattern of enabling had been so deeply ingrained in our family dynamics that I hadn't recognized how destructive it had become until the crisis with her wedding planning forced me to examine my own role in perpetuating Rebecca's irresponsible behavior. Every time I had bailed her out of a financial emergency, I had actually been teaching her that she didn't need to develop better money management skills or make more responsible choices about spending and debt. I had also learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to refuse to participate in their self-destructive patterns, even when that refusal creates conflict and temporary estrangement. Rebecca had needed to experience the real consequences of her financial irresponsibility in order to develop healthier habits and a more honest relationship with money, but our family's pattern of rescuing her had prevented her from learning these essential life skills. The intervention that forced Rebecca to confront her debt problems had been painful for everyone involved, but it had ultimately been necessary to break a cycle that was becoming more destructive with each repetition. Her spending addiction had been escalating over the years, and without intervention, it would have eventually destroyed her relationship with David and created even more serious financial and legal consequences. The situation had also highlighted the importance of financial compatibility and transparency in romantic relationships. David and Rebecca's marriage might not have survived if her debts and spending habits had remained hidden until after their wedding, when legal and financial entanglements would have made the consequences even more severe and more difficult to address through counseling and behavior change. Financial deception in marriage creates a foundation of mistrust that can undermine even the strongest emotional connections between partners. David's discovery of Rebecca's secret debts had forced him to question not just her financial judgment, but her honesty and integrity in other areas of their relationship. The process of rebuilding trust had required extensive therapy and transparent communication that might not have been possible if the deception had continued for months or years after their wedding. The experience had also revealed important truths about the nature of family relationships and the difference between conditional and unconditional support. I had come to understand that truly loving someone sometimes requires setting boundaries that protect both people from destructive patterns, rather than providing unlimited assistance that enables harmful behavior. My relationship with our parents had also evolved as a result of the crisis with Rebecca's wedding. They had been forced to confront their own role in creating Rebecca's sense of entitlement and their habit of rescuing her from the consequences of poor decisions while expecting me to be completely self-sufficient. The disparity in their treatment of us had created resentment and dysfunction that affected our entire family dynamic. Our parents had gradually begun to understand that their well-intentioned efforts to help Rebecca had actually prevented her from developing the resilience and responsibility that would serve her well in adult life. They had started setting their own boundaries around financial assistance and requiring Rebecca to demonstrate genuine effort towards solving her own problems before they would provide any support. The process of addressing Rebecca's financial problems had been long and difficult, involving multiple forms of professional assistance and a complete restructuring of her relationship with money and spending. The credit counseling sessions had helped her understand the true cost of her debt and develop realistic plans for repayment, while the therapy sessions had addressed the underlying emotional and psychological factors that drove her compulsive spending behavior. Rebecca had initially resisted the idea that her spending patterns represented a form of addiction, but she had gradually come to understand that her relationship with money was driven by emotional needs that shopping and debt accumulation couldn't actually satisfy. The therapy had helped her identify the triggers that led to spending binges and develop healthier coping strategies for managing stress, anxiety, and feelings of inadequacy. The practical aspects of financial recovery had been equally challenging, requiring Rebecca to take on additional work, drastically reduce her expenses, and maintain strict budgets that eliminated all discretionary spending until her debts were under control. She had been forced to sell her car and use public transportation, move to a smaller and less expensive apartment, and give up the yoga studio space she had been renting for her classes. But perhaps most importantly, Rebecca had been required to be completely honest with David about all aspects of her financial situation, including debts and obligations that she had previously hidden from him. This transparency had been essential for rebuilding trust in their relationship, but it had also been humiliating and emotionally difficult for someone who had spent years maintaining the illusion of financial stability. David's response to Rebecca's financial crisis had demonstrated both his character and his commitment to their relationship. Rather than ending their engagement when he discovered the extent of her deception, he had insisted on addressing the problems together while maintaining clear boundaries about honesty and accountability. His willingness to support Rebecca through the recovery process while refusing to enable her destructive behavior had been crucial to her eventual success in overcoming her spending addiction. The wedding that eventually took place had been a completely different celebration from what Rebecca had originally envisioned, but it had been more meaningful and authentic than the expensive event she had initially demanded. The ceremony was held at David's parents' church, with decorations created by family members and friends who contributed their time and creativity rather than expensive professional services. The reception had featured food prepared by David's extended family, using family recipes that created a much more personal and intimate dining experience than any catered meal could have provided. Rebecca's yoga students had volunteered to help with setup and cleanup, and several of David's basketball players had served as ushers and general assistants throughout the day. The photography had been handled by a talented amateur photographer who was a friend of the family, and while the pictures weren't as polished as those from the expensive professional Rebecca had originally selected, they captured genuine moments of joy and celebration that reflected the true spirit of the occasion. Most importantly, the modest celebration had been paid for entirely with money that David and Rebecca had saved together, without any debt or financial assistance from family members. The sense of accomplishment and shared responsibility they felt in creating their wedding within their own means had been more valuable than any expensive venue or luxury service could have provided. The delayed timeline for their wedding had actually strengthened their relationship by forcing them to address fundamental issues about money, honesty, and shared values before making a lifetime commitment to each other. The process of working through Rebecca's financial problems had taught them communication skills and conflict resolution strategies that would serve them well throughout their marriage. Looking back now, several years after that difficult period, I can see that the crisis created by Rebecca's wedding demands had actually been an opportunity for our entire family to address long-standing patterns of dysfunction and enabling that had been affecting all of our relationships. The short-term pain of confronting these issues had led to long-term healing and growth for everyone involved. Rebecca's marriage to David has thrived since they worked through the financial issues that initially threatened their relationship. She has continued her therapy and has developed much healthier spending habits, while David has learned to appreciate the strength and determination that helped Rebecca overcome her addiction to debt and financial chaos. The yoga studio Rebecca had dreamed of opening became a reality 3 years after their wedding, but it was funded through careful saving and a modest business loan rather than credit card debt and family bailouts. The studio has been successful partly because Rebecca's experience with financial recovery gave her credibility and empathy when working with clients who were dealing with their own life challenges. My own relationship with money and family boundaries has also evolved as a result of this experience. I learned to distinguish between supporting someone's genuine efforts to improve their situation and enabling destructive behavior that hurts everyone involved. I also developed better communication skills for setting and maintaining boundaries around financial requests from family members. The incident with Rebecca's wedding demands had been a wake-up call that forced me to examine my own role in perpetuating unhealthy family dynamics. I realized that my willingness to repeatedly bail Rebecca out of financial trouble had actually been preventing her from developing the skills and resilience she needed to manage her own life successfully. I also learned that protecting someone from the consequences of their actions is not the same as protecting them from harm. Sometimes the most protective thing you can do is allow someone to experience the natural results of their choices, even when those results are painful or embarrassing. The experience had strengthened my relationship with David, who had come to appreciate my honesty and concern for his welfare even though it had created short-term problems in his relationship with Rebecca. He had thanked me several times for giving him the information he needed to make informed decisions about his future, and we had developed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared concern for Rebecca's well-being. Our extended family had also learned valuable lessons about the importance of consistency and boundaries when dealing with financial irresponsibility. Rebecca's cousins and aunts who had lent her money for the wedding had realized that their well-intentioned help had actually enabled her destructive behavior, and they had developed better strategies for supporting family members without creating dependency. The most important lesson for me had been understanding that love sometimes requires difficult choices and uncomfortable conversations. It would have been easier to pay for Rebecca's wedding and avoid the confrontation that followed, but that choice would have harmed both Rebecca and David in the long run while perpetuating patterns that were already causing significant damage. Today, Rebecca and David have a strong marriage built on honesty, shared goals, and financial responsibility. Rebecca's yoga studio continues to grow and prosper, and she has become an advocate for financial literacy and addiction recovery in her community. David has been promoted to department head at his school and is pursuing a master's degree in educational administration that will expand his career opportunities. My own career has continued to flourish, and I have been able to use my financial stability to support causes and organizations that align with my values rather than repeatedly bailing family members out of self-created crises. I have also developed a much healthier relationship with my sister, one based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. The experience taught me that being called someone's personal bank is not a compliment. It's a sign that the relationship has become unbalanced and potentially harmful to everyone involved. Real family support involves helping people develop the skills and strength they need to solve their own problems, not solving those problems for them indefinitely. Looking back at that moment in Mrs. Mitchell's living room when Rebecca casually announced that I would pay for her wedding, I can see it as a turning point that forced everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths about money, responsibility, and family relationships. The short-term pain of that confrontation led to long-term healing and growth for everyone involved. Rebecca's entitled demand that I serve as her personal bank had been the catalyst for changes that ultimately saved her marriage, her financial future, and our relationship as sisters. Sometimes the most loving response to unreasonable demands is a firm refusal that forces everyone to find healthier ways of relating to each other. The secret debts that I revealed to David had been symptoms of deeper problems that needed professional attention rather than family enabling. By refusing to pay for the wedding and instead exposing the financial deception that was threatening their relationship, I had given both Rebecca and David the opportunity to build their marriage on a foundation of honesty and shared responsibility. The story of Rebecca's wedding demands and the revelation of her secret debts became a defining moment for our entire family, one that taught us all important lessons about love, boundaries, and the difference between helping and enabling. It was a painful but necessary experience that ultimately made all of our relationships stronger and more authentic.